AIGA, Eyes on Design. Hello and welcome to another episode of the AIGA Design Podcast. We're now in season 11. My name is Lishan Huang, co-executive director of learning and programs here at AIGA, the Professional Association for Design.
Hello, everyone. I'm Giulia Donatello, design competitions and event manager at AIGA.
So this season on the show, we are exploring the theme of Eyes on Design. It's also the overarching theme for our programming in general at AIGA this year, which includes this podcast, as well as a conference and a Creatives in Residence program that we'll talk to you about later in the year. This season's theme is inspired by the legacy of the acclaimed AIGA Eye on Design publication that ran from 2015 to 2022, which challenged us in the design community to look deeper, connect more broadly, and think further about design. So we have different eyes that we're looking through this season on a podcast, ironically enough, although if you're on YouTube, you can also see us. We have the connecting eye, which is connecting design to other disciplines like technology, science, the arts, culture, business, etc. The critical eye, which critique and commentary are such important pillars of design itself in order to be better with what we do, but also to be critical of how our environments are designed around us. And then also taking a future eye, looking at the future of how technology is shaping design practice and how design practice is shaping the future.
For the folks that are based in New York City, we wanted to share an invitation for you to join the book exhibition that is happening at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn on March 19th. So we're going to add the link for the registration in the show notes, but we hope to see some of you there to celebrate the 50 books, 50 covers winners from last year's edition and connect with the design community from New York.
I'd like to introduce our guest. We're really excited to have her back, Giorgia Lupi, who is a partner at Pentagram in New York. I was looking back at our old episodes and we had Giorgia here last on the show back in 2020. So quite a long time ago, a very different world. And she was also at our 2023 design conference, which was in New York City, part of a celebration of Pentagram's 50th anniversary. So looking forward to catching up with Giorgia.
Thanks so much for having me again. It's such a pleasure.
So let's just dive right into stuff. I'd love to hear more about your background and some of your work, and then we'll just kind of take it from there. But the first question is, can you tell us about the moment where you first felt the spark to become a designer? Like, what set you on this path? We heard a little bit about your grandmother's tailor shop in Italy, but we'd love to hear more about that origin story of yours.
Yeah, of course. Well, I studied architecture in college, which I think in a way is a form of design. I mean, it is
definitely
the bigger discipline of design, right? In a way, for where I was coming from, like studying graphic design already wasn't even on my radar around where I was living, design. And especially, I think, 20 years ago or so, there was so much more that it was about furniture design and object design. And so industrial design back in Italy at that time. And I felt that studying architecture, it was going to give me the opportunity to still have like a very structured and solid foundational background, almost like a bit of like an engineering and like scientific background, and at the same time express myself creatively. And so that I think was the moment when I was like, okay, I'm not going to do an art school. I'm not going to become a mathematician or engineer, but I'm going to just like pursue that. But I think obviously in retrospect, like you mentioned, especially for the kind of work that I do that has a lot to do with data and recording and collecting and categorizing information. It's now it's easy to say, but in retrospect, I say that I've always been a data collector. The anecdote that you were mentioning about my grandmother's tailor shop, I don't know why everybody likes it. Like I keep getting asked about that. It's really that I used to spend a lot of time, besides drawing, like a lot of kids, just very meticulously and probably obsessively reorganizing my grandmother's like tools, like buttons and threads and ribbons. And I would decide every day whether it was, grouping them for different colors, whether a button had 1 hole, 2 holes, or 3 holes. And like every day I would kind of like build my visual taxonomies on her table. And I kind of really found it soothing and interesting. And even if I was working with a very limited set of materials, it felt that there was infinite possibilities. The design new ways of looking at them. And so, but then leaping forward, I think I've always kind of like that aspect of information that becomes an element to design with, and like really then fell in love with data and data visualization. And I mean, I could speak for the next 10 minutes about my whole background, but I'll stop if you want to dig a little deeper in anything. But in a way, the moment that I got the spark to become a designer, I think that's another anecdote though, which is probably when I decided to take in the design of the artwork of the CD at the time of my heavy metal band that I was playing the keyboard on. It was the beginning of my I was already studying architecture, right? But I think it was the beginning of like using Photoshop. And again, I'm aging myself, but at the beginning we were doing everything manual. And we put out a CD of these very weird, strange heavy metal long songs. And I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to design the logo for the band and I'm going to design the whole artwork. And so I think that was really, really interesting to think about. Not a long architecture project, but more of like, I'm just going to design something that I can see printed right away.
Yeah. Thanks for connecting those dots from both your family heritage with the tailor shop to the heavy metal band to the architecture school. I actually also got into graphic design originally as a musician. I was in an indie band in the late 90s. And so it was like playing with Photoshop with my bandmates to make our graphics on one of those like colored iMacs, that first generation iMac with those like jelly colors.
They were pretty cool. I had one too.
Yeah.
So Giorgia, you published a book last year called Speak Data. I have here.
Yes.
With me. Beautiful. I love it. I had the privilege to actually go to the launch event at Pentagram. So it was great seeing you and Philip talk a lot about the process. I wanted to hear from you. What was the spark behind writing this book? And how did the process go? And how long did it take? And did the rise of AI in the past years influence, in a way, the direction of the book or not at all?
So we're jumping very, very forward, right? Maybe as a context for the listeners, like after I studied architecture, I became a designer, and my work really is a lot of visualization of data and storytelling with data. And as much as right now at Pentagram, I joined 7 years ago, I work on broader projects, I work on brand identities. I think that in general, I've been always thinking about how data, which is both quantitative and qualitative information, like anything that can be recorded and organized and categorized, can really be an interesting language and material that we can use to express ideas visually. And so I think throughout my practice, I've in different ways through what I call data humanism and other projects and some books that I've done before, really wanted to bring the humanity back to data. And, especially since data started to become more ubiquitous, people might have been frightened by data and thinking that data is just like cold and inhuman entity hovering over us, data that gets collected from us. But I think with my work and with what I believe, I really wanted to bring it back to what data actually is, which is an abstraction of reality that we human beings created because we couldn't record and store life on a hard drive. And so with that premise, after many years of working over it, my co-author Phil, and who was a collaborator at Pentagram, we worked together for 5 years, and I really decided to put out a book that is almost like a book that we wanted for ourselves in a way, like a non-technical, non-hyper-specialized in data book where we could even pique the brains of people that might not necessarily be data experts, but they actually see data in their field. And so the book is a book, it's called Speak Data, obviously, hints at the fact that data is a language that we can speak. Mm-hmm. And it's our ideas and thoughts and example for our projects in the past about 5 different macro areas: data and identity, data and communication, data and health, data and creativity, and data and technology. But also we interviewed 17 incredible thinker, artists, researchers, scientists, doctors, people that are really at the top of their field, that don't necessarily maybe think of themselves as data practitioner, but that in our mind really could give us a broader perspective of data in, again, climate or general organizational psychology or the habits that we make and break about counting ourselves. Again, art, health especially, and definitely technology and AI. And so there's 17 interviews. What I think is interesting about every interview is that as much as we dive kind of deep into the interviewees' ideas and background around data, we also ask everybody one similar question, which is their own definition of data. And so flipping through, it's a different colored page. You can read 17 profoundly different but very inspiring definitions of data. I think what's really kind of interesting to our conversation in general data humanism is that very few, if probably not anybody, of these people describe data as like the truth or like the quantitative reality that all of us need to abide to, but much more as in like a way of thinking, a form of memory, a point of drama in a story. So again, very, very, very human ways of looking at it. So that was a long description of Speak Data. I think, though, that to your question, Giulia, Phil and I have been thinking about writing a book about data humanism for a long time, actually, probably for the 5 years that we worked together at Pentagram. And he used to be a strategist on my team, and we worked very closely on content of the project. But I think when we were thinking about writing it just from our own perspective, it kind of really felt that it missed something, because as much as we've been working in the data storytelling and design field for the majority of the time, and we deal with different clients that have expertise in particular fields. We thought that in a way as designers, we're a little farther away from the reality that we wanted readers to encounter. And so, I don't know if I answered all your questions about the book.
Yes, totally. I'm curious also if you felt that the interviewees, after they participated in the conversations about data, did you feel that they started perceiving their own practice in a different way?
Well, I think we have been lucky to interview pretty well-established people like Paola Antonelli, senior curator of architecture and design in MoMA, James Clear, who's this best-selling author about personal habits and development. Adam Grant is this, again, pretty famous organizational psychologist at UPenn, the artist Rafika Nadal. I am not Seth Godin, like communication guru, so I don't know that they've started to think about their practice different, but I think that probably all of them had to pause and really think about their own definition of data. And I think that was like an interesting moment of the conversation where many people said, I really never thought about it. And so I think in general, hopefully, they all said it was an inspiring conversation. I think probably, I hope that they left with more question than answers, which I think is always my point around data. I don't think that we can paint a definitive picture. Like we can't paint a final definitive picture about any language, whether it's English, Italian, Spanish. It's a thing that's always evolving. We just have to figure out how to stay on track in the path.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So moving forward, I actually was introduced to the Dear Data project by a professor of mine in a class that I took at Parsons when I was pursuing my master's degree there. The class was data visualization. And funny enough, as you were saying, that data is a language that you also learn how to read. He himself is a poet and also a designer. So it's very interesting how he understands coding as another way of looking at data, same as poetry, So I think it really resonated to what I experienced in his class. So the Dear Data project became a book, and it's also part of the MoMA's permanent collection, which is incredible. I wanted to hear from you, how did that idea first come to life between the two of you? And once you received each, I think it was weekly postcards, did you immediately get what they meant? Did you discuss about your own interpretation of it as the project was evolving? How was a little bit of the conversation on the back end? And I also wanted to hear if this project has always meant to be a public project, or if it started as a personal project in the beginning.
Yeah, sure. So Dear Data is a year-long correspondence that in 2014, Stephanie Pozovic, an amazing data visualization designer from the UK, actually she's American, but she lives in London, and myself kind of like embarked on, where for an entire year, every week, we would collect data on a shared topic about our lives, from our thoughts to our behaviors to our interaction with our partners to the sounds around it. And at the end of the week, we would draw a postcard data drawing at the front of the card. And at the back of the card, we wrote the address of the other person and the legend, so how to interpret it. And every week, we'd send it from New York to London and from London to New York. So that's what the project is for people that might not have heard about it. And so Stephanie and I only met twice in life before deciding to do this very intense form of correspondence. And we met at a conference that was really, really amazing that was happening every year, around that time. It was called AIGA in Minneapolis, a really amazing media art and data visualization conference. And we were both at that conference that at the time, I believe it was 2012 and then 2013, pretty much like a very digitally influenced space of media art and digital art. But both of us were talking, and like she was teaching a workshop and I was giving a talk about drawing with data and about the liberating power of not having technology in your hands as you work with data. And over dinner, for the speaker dinner, we found out that we had so much in common. We were exactly the same age, only children, both expats, and many, many other things. And we really said, we have to do something here. We have to collaborate. And over the course of a summer of back and forth, email exchanges and a couple of calls, we figured out a format. We kind of want to use data to see and challenge ourselves. Can we actually get to know each other, like become friends in a way? Because imagine that, again, we met in person 2 evenings, had a couple of calls to figure it out, but we really didn't know each other. And can we do it through data only? So for the rest of the year, besides really sharing a spreadsheet of the topics, receiving postcards and commenting on funny anecdotes that we could read from the legend, we really didn't have other calls or anything, but it was very much like a way to paint a portrait of a person in 52 weeks through their activities, their way of thinking, their surroundings, and all of that. And I think that, was it always meant to be a public project? I don't think so, but at the same time, both being designers were used to speak about their work. I think we both knew that if we could pull it off and make it to 52 weeks, we would have talked about it, right? But I think probably after 10 or 15 weeks, we were texting, we were saying, this is kind of really nice to see. We should just put it up on a website. And we designed a very basic Squarespace. And because each of us took a lot of notes in the week, we decided to do a week by week page in Dear Data where we just, posted the pictures of the sketches that we were making and any other notes. And then long story short, a blogger that was very famous at the time, I still think she's famous, Maria Popova from Brain Pickings, picked it up. And then, at the end of the article that she published said, this project calls for a publisher. And obviously, because she's very visible in the publishing world, we got contacted. And so I think the whole thing snowballed a little bit in a positive way. And I also think that at some point when people learned about the project through that article, we weren't finished yet. But people were waiting for what's coming next week.
The next one. Okay.
When there's a thing that that the content will be updated, and it's kind of interesting to peek in the life of a stranger of sorts. So
that's great. So folks were waiting for the publication weekly that you would post. Oh, that's great. That's awesome.
That was kind of fun in the last weeks of the project. So I think that both Stephanie and I would really not embark on that thing again. But what I found fascinating is that after that, I have seen so many people that, first of all, the project went incredibly well because thousands of people, not even designers or artists, decided to experiment on themselves and use this form of data collection and drawing. But there have been I would say at least a couple of dozens of couples of any sort that pulled up 2 weeks of postcards themselves. And I'm telling you, it's a constant collection of things around it. You spend the weekends drawing. So I'm very, admiring these people that decided to do it for themselves after us.
I love it.
Yeah, that's great that you can inspire other people to do stuff. I actually wanted to go off script and talk about that too. At the AIGA Design Conference last year in Los Angeles, we had two guys, both named Craig, who did a 52-week project. This one was online, but basically one of them is an illustrator, Craig Frazier. The other guy is a photographer. I'm forgetting the other Craig's last name, but basically they would choose a word every week that they would interpret, and then one of them would draw and the other one would take a picture, and then they would show each other. And then the twist at the conference was that it was the first time they met in person when they met to talk about their project at our conference, because they had just met online. So I think just this idea of like doing something with like a relative stranger, whether it's just somebody you know online or someone you met at a conference, and then having this time-bound thing to it. And maybe it's just a creative thing. It gets you a book, it gets you into the MoMA, or it gets you at the AIGA design conference stage. I think there's something really important about doing that outside of, you know, your client work and your usual job.
Yeah. It's really, I need to check that project out. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think that Stephanie and I, after that, we became friends, right? And we've obviously, and we've reflected on the fact that probably we could really pull it off so intensely for 52 weeks because we didn't know each other, because we kind of didn't want to let the other person down. There's like an accountability of having to do something with somebody that is not your friend. Like to your friend, you can say, you know, I'm so busy this week, I just can't make it. But I think that structure was really interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting how the fact that you were not so close actually helped the process move forward. Very interesting, yeah.
I'd like to pivot to talk about another project of yours, Giorgia, which is a data love letter to the subway. And I think as a former longtime New Yorker myself, and I know, you know, you and Julia live in New York, there's this kind of like love-hate relationship that New Yorkers have with the subway because we just spend so much of our lives there. But for this project, I understand that you got data from the MTA. We'd love to learn more about the behind the scenes process of this. Like, how did you start to tell a meaningful story out of this data that they gave you? And what was the original brief and how did you shape that?
Totally. I mean, in fact, the brief was completely open. It wasn't even about data from the MTA. So the MTA has a program called MTA Arts and Design. That is the program that commissions all the both permanent and temporary art that you see in the subway. So, you know, some permanent art are the beautiful mosaic that you see tiled up in some of the subway stations. And their more temporary programs are performances and music, but also taking over the digital spaces that you see in different stations that usually are dedicated to advertising. Obviously, they pay the bill for the whole thing for 2 minutes at the top of every hour with an artist that like takes over for a few months with a video installation. And so they called me because, you know, they liked my work with like one of the biggest centers as a place, which is Fulton Center, which has 52 very different screens, some of which are gigantic. And they pretty much told me, do whatever you want. Like, we really want to work with you. Obviously, it's about presenting concepts, and it's not just like, go back and we'll see you in 3 months. But right away, I mean, of course, I think a dream of every person that lives in New York and designer, and especially somebody that works with data, is doing something with the data of the MTA. And so with my team, we kind of sat down, and I think that all of us, and especially, I mean, I always knew that I wanted to do something very poetic with the data of the subway, because it'll be so easy to look at this data set and think about plotting the ridership times and numbers. And, you know, we've all seen countless of maps with like the turnstile count or like the trains that go real time. But I think there's something so much poetic to think about these lines as characters, as these sort of like characters in a way that every day encounter themselves. They cross and they move apart and they keep crossing again. And I think that in a way, we've just unpacked this complexity of the subway system to the very minimal elements. And so you'll see this 2 minutes video also has a bit of like a picture book style, where the A train gets introduced right away with a wide background and this kind of like almost like lo-fi way of a line to enter. And then the A train meets the C, and then they kind of like break apart. So really building this story. And then they start to encounter other train at Fulton Center. And at some point, after we've made the audience realize that these lines are our trains, we start to unpack all sort of data, like where do they go from the neighborhood of or origin to where they go to sleep at night? What if we put one all after another, which will be the longest? And what are the ones that go up above the ground, and what are the ones that are not? And many other views of unpacking the data from the timeline they were built, and actually concluding with something that I've always been fascinated about, which is this Craigslist column that started couple of decades ago called Missed Connection. Missed is this column when people can log on something like, I saw you with a red beret at that corner the other day. Write me back if you saw me too. Like this kind of like sparks of interest. And there's so many that are in the subway. So many that are about, you were sitting on the L train close to me at 6:45 and we, exchanged a gaze, right? And so we kind of like had two like interesting ones to just also show that ultimately it's a very, very human ecosystem when we all usually kind of like complain about the subway, but the subway brings us everywhere. They connect us to lives of strangers. And so the whole thing, it's a bit of like a human, in a way, love letter to the subway with the excuse of data as a way to tell it.
So another project connected to data, but just very different. But I think you've started alluding to some of these themes, talking about the New York City subway trains as characters. In 2024, you published a book, This Is Me and Only Me, which is a book for children. And that's about data too, right? About personal data. And like, what was it like designing for kids and writing for kids and like taking what you do, but like shifting the audience?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I actually really love it. And I think I've loved both projects because if you think about it, when you have to make a story of any kind compelling to a child, in a way, you have to reduce it to the very essence of it. And the poetry of those kind of stories are not given by complex words or way to articulate a phrase, but I think to the very magic of the mundanity of life. And so I really, really like it. And I hope I'll be able to do more things for children, even if I don't have children myself. But so the idea I've had for a long time of simply building a character of a book, which is a graphic element that starts relatively simple. In this case, it's a hollowed black stroke on a circle on a white page. And the more that they collect data about themselves, like the more that they go out and log some interactions, or even just kind of like notice the moments that they're sad and why, the moments that they're happy, the more it kind of really starts to build a data portrait with more colors and shape of themselves that is very unique to them, because the only image of yourself is the one that you build through how you look at life. And so at the time, this is another collaboration with Madeline Gardner, who also used to work with me at Pentagram. She was a preschool teacher before becoming a project manager. And because, again, I have somehow a limited experience really interacting with children, she really helped out making sure that the examples that we were making through the book were going to resonate with children. And I think it was like, I always really love to collaborate too, because I feel like a bouncing back and forth of ideas is great. And so that was another really, really nice one. And I think, as much as the publisher, it's like a smaller Italian publisher, Pietro Corraini, that I love because he published all the Munaris books. And so the distribution is not as wide as some of my primarily American published book. It's going pretty well. People that found the way to get their hands on it are usually sending me a nice picture of their children kind of like moving around and like trying to draw their own data portraits too. So it's pretty fun.
We've talked about a few examples of your projects, your work, Giorgia. I'd like to hear about how you reflect on this and how you think about data or the through line of these different projects. You've already said that you think about data both as quantitative and qualitative. Are there any other projects that you'd like to share about like the complexity of data that challenged you, and how did you work through that, especially on these both ends of the quantitative and qualitative?
It's interesting because I think I've had this question being asked to me a few times. What was a project where the data was really challenging? And I rarely find an answer, because I believe that in general, in any data set, if you're able to ask the right questions and entry point to go and look at them, can be in a way parsed. And I think to me, almost like the hardest data set that I have presented with are the ones where they're simply aggregated numbers of statistics that cannot get in granular to what the data actually made for. Because I think like the more that you can instead disaggregate and find data points that are more relatable to a local story, to a human being versus big aggregated trends, the more it's you have infinite possibilities to find a story. But you're also asking me about what is the through line. I mean, I think that getting to, in any kind of data set or topic, with very human questions in mind. Because I think that sometimes when we look at data, we think about, okay, how do we show efficiency or optimizations, and that's in a trend, or if things are going better and worse, sure, and that's a human question in a way, but ultimately as human beings, we all want to understand, how does that relate to us? If we're talking about climate change and big trends, it's really hard to relate to temperature rising globally by 1.5 degrees in the last 100 years. But when you start to instead, through a visualization, unpack the very consequences that can happen to you in your backyard, in your life, to not be able to see the butterfly flying there anymore because they're migrating due to climate change, or the fact that soon we'll not probably be able to go and visit Venice anymore because of the water level rising. Like, if you can do that with any kind of data set, I think that in a way, the complexity gets easily unpacked into a very human story. So the through line for me is really looking for human stories. And I think that for me, it's kind of easy because I know that as a person, I am obsessed with human nature. Like, I constantly am thinking about what makes us who we are. Why do we make decisions? What, the way that we relate to each other and to our internal world. And so I think it's just something that I keep thinking about all the time besides design.
Giorgia, in the AIGA Design podcast that we had you in 2020, you said something that stayed with me. So you said something around that you designed the data set, not just the outcome. So I'm curious to hear from you if there is any unconventional research methods or data collection practices that you've explored throughout the years that you can share. And if you still are keen of using more analog methods, as in example, like you did for Dear Data, if you can share a little bit about that.
Sure. So probably what I was referring to when I said, we also designed the data set. It's something that, if you think about it, probably applies to the majority of people that work with data, because as much as we think that data is objective and it's out there, well, what do you decide to include and to leave out of a story is a form of data design. Like, you design the data set that you work with, even if you don't go and manipulate the Excel spread, cells on a spreadsheet. And I think in a way, designing your data set means understanding if the primary data that you're working with, again, imagine that it's a trend for climate change, just to give an example. Is that enough to tell a story, or do we have to complement it with points that can anchor to the main data set and provide context? For example, again, if there's a trend over time, what happened in the pivotal moments of these trends? Why don't we go down and look what really happened? Or if there's particular categories that we can unpack these trends on, how can we unpack the context for that particular category? And so to me, it's almost like the difference between stopping at reading an article at the headline and this abstract paragraph, and then instead going and reading everything that really happened, right? And I think that I see data visualizations and data storytelling of any kind as a possibility to access the complexity and the fullness of all the human stories that go into that. And I don't think that because of that, it means that we're manipulating the data or that we're being unfaithful to the data. I think it's really just about recognizing that every single data set is subjective because a human being decided what to include and what to leave out. And then when you have that premise, to me, the more you're able to add context, to add details, to point out when things were uncertain in a data set and where things were missing, the more that you're faithful to the story. So that doesn't necessarily mean that a collection needs to be analog. I think that especially right now that at Pentagram, I have a big team, I have a lot of projects going on. I always start sketching, if I have to just work on a project and translate something visually, but I don't do the obsessive data collection of like recording things about my life in that way. I think when I'll be curious about something else, I'll probably do it. Maybe there's another artistic projects that I'll tackle like that. But I think, even in very, very digital first way, you can still combine data set in a way that will help the reader or the audience get a fuller picture and also get their own point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. That's a great perspective. When I started my career, like 15 plus years ago, the disciplines were very separated. So to do qualitative research and deal with qualitative data, you had to be psychologists or anthropologists, sociologists. And when it comes to quantitative data, it was more like for economists, engineers, and so on. And this context has completely changed. And I wanted to hear from you from a perspective that someone that is very fluent across different types of data. How do you mentor your teams so they get more confidence in navigating across quantitative and qualitative data, on how they zoom in and zoom out, and so on?
Yeah, so I think that in a way, well, first of all, when I started working with data, my partner at my previous company called AGGA, his name was Simone, was a sociologist. And so we really paired up, and me as a designer, working a lot on like primarily qualitative information. But at the same time, from a pure data visualization perspective, if you only have qualitative information, it's really hard to anchor them onto anything that can build an architecture of a visualization that is not just simply groupings in a way and color coding. And so I think that from a design perspective, the possibility to anchor any qualitative data to quantitative points is just simply a very useful tool to be able to tell a story that is a story through time, be able to tell a story that is a geographic story, be able to have some element of factual evidences, right? And so that's just a little bit of how I came into this qualitative and quantitative. And I think that in a way, the quantitative aspects is a little bit more of like the anchoring part to then express the qualities in the data. So I kind of feel like the quantity anchors down and the quality kind of like opens up. And when I work with my team, it's kind of interesting because right now I only have one person in my team that is an actual data practitioner. She's a data journalist and used to work at the New York Times and then became a designer. So she's very in my world. But the majority of the other designers and strategists on my team don't really come from a data background. And I think that obviously if they work with me, they had an interest in it. But what I found in all of them is that they have a mind for understanding data. And so I don't think that necessarily, especially right now with all the tools that we have available, you don't have to be a computer science or a psychologist, qualitative research to be able to work with data from a design perspective. I think you have to have an understanding of quantities and encoding them into visuals and a general sense of how do you tell a story through time. And then you have to have really good questions and storytelling capabilities. I think that in general, I still prompt my team all the time to think about the story, to think about how people will relate with that story, to think about what is the goal for the audience, to also think about, what is the type of engagement that our audience can be. Because again, some of our visualization can be very experimental and might require a bit more of engagement. Some other needs to be a bit more straightforward. So I think it's almost like reminding the team of questions that maybe a lot of designers ask themselves, just knowing that one of our tools that we have is data, not only typography, not only a graphic line, but we can encode that. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that I approached the whole thing from a design perspective more than from a researcher perspective.
Makes sense. Makes total sense.
I wanted to pivot to this hot topic of AI, which is both a hot topic and a sort of over-discussed topic. And, Giorgia, you've commented on this in different ways. In 2024 in Fast Company, you said you were tired of this fast, repetitive, Instagram-driven design of thoughtless AI adoption, but you've also posted positive things about AI, like also 2 years ago, posting on LinkedIn about how ChatGPT has helped the patient-doctor interactions and actually helped with those sort of interactions. So, how do you...
anything about ChatGPT helping doctors and patients interaction? I don't know that I've ever done that.
Oh, so you were saying you were quoting Eric Topol about a Substack? Yeah.
Sure, that's just something that Eric Topol, who was one of the interviewees of Dear Data, said. And so I think it was probably to say that he has a bit of a positive perspective on AI, because especially when it comes to a doctor and a patient, I don't remember the dimension ChatGPT, but in general, AI can help patients have a bit more agency on the amount of general data and information that it comes to them, and then go to a doctor who can be more of like a provider of wisdom more than necessarily the keeper of the information. I think that generally I do have not a too, I wouldn't say a too optimistic view of AI, but I really think that there needs to be a very particular kind of care and critical thinking around it. I personally broke up with ChatGPT a while ago. I started to use Midjourney early on, and it was kind of fun to experiment, but never felt like anything that I could really bring to the next level. But yeah, do you want me to elaborate a little bit more on this part, or?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about how you look at this through the lens of data humanism, right? Like, because humanism is so core to what you do and the way that you approach data, and AI is based on these huge data sets. And, it seems like you've gone on your own journey with different tools and experimenting and maybe breaking up with them. So how do you think about that through the lens of data humanism as really the center of your practice?
I mean, I think that in general, when we think about AI, and I'm quoting Kate Crawford from the book. She's one of the interviewees, and she's a AI researcher and scholar that was talking about AI in the world 12 years ago when we were still like, what, maybe. And I think that she points out in the beginning that AI is neither artificial or intelligence. AI is a resource heavy consuming of energy and actually relying on information that is there that has never been consented to, credited, or compensated, these 3 C's. And so I think it's important to kind of frame what AI is, or probably we all know. But it's also important to think about, what does it do for us right now, humans? And through the lens of, I wouldn't even necessarily call it data humanism, but a human perspective to using technology, I don't necessarily believe, and again, these are personal opinions, that these frictionless, I type something and I get a response that is digested, likely wrong too, by a generative algorithm, really helps us get to the fullest of our potential. I think that we don't have to think less. If anything, in a world where we're generally, even if it doesn't come to AI, bombarded by information constantly, there's headline and things that come our way. If anything, we need to develop more critical thinking and intentionality. And so I personally don't believe that the flattening of the thinking, the flattening of the writing, the flattening of I get a response very quick is helpful to what could be an healthy development of humanity. Now, I'm also not somebody that says we should completely never use AI, right? I think that in anything, we're still in a bubble period where there's a lot that is changing. There's some things that will keep happening, and hopefully there's some of the more distorted and dystopian ways of using AI that will go. But I think that we need to be really careful. And I feel that for practitioners that have been, if it comes to design or anything else, for people that have been around for a while and have seen a world without AI, it's maybe even less problematic that when I see young designers or young people that really, really, really rely on it for everything, for interactions with other peers, for generating ideas is what scares me the most, because I feel that needs to be very human thing. Because if you think about it, and Eye on Design, that's your podcast, that's the topic, generally that you want to cover on. I believe that designers, to learn how to design, you need to learn how to see, and you need to develop your own critical personal understanding of the world. You look around. If the 3 of us go to the same show, the same art exhibition, we read the same book, we walk around the same city, our eyes and brains will take in different things that contribute to our own sensibility, and will and kind of really shape the sense of who we are. And I think that if that part is flattened because you put in a prompt for an idea and an AI generative tool have access to all the reference in a way that is not yours, I think that the process really breaks. And I think that this is the flattening of design that probably I was talking about. And so I'm kind of a little concerned for the younger designers that have never really experienced the process without it.
So, Giorgia, as we're wrapping up today, we wanted to hear from you if you have any inspiring recommendations for our listeners. It could be a book, movie, an exhibition, or a song, album that you've heard about it in the last months that you wanted to share.
Interesting, because I feel that if I'm thinking about what has inspired me recently, It's actually probably none of the above. I mean, I went to see the Ruth Asawa exhibition at MoMA, which unfortunately is already closed, and so it's a little hard to suggest it, which was, I think, really incredible for a couple of reasons. But I think, I don't know. Okay, and what an advice, an inspiration will be to make more for the sake of making, because I feel that lately I've been painting and loving painting so much. I have never been somebody who was like a painter. Like I really, up until last year, almost really didn't even take the brush up. But I'm kind of really realizing that when we are so constrained in the client world or even in the project like work to make things because we need to solve a brief of a client, because we need to put a project online, because the whole thing needs to have the shape of a project, or because there's an utility to it, you really play and experiment less. And I think the freedom of just saying, like, I have absolutely no goal, and today I'm going to paint. I'm not doing it because I want to become a fine artist as a profession, has really, I think, highlighted an area of my brain. When you keep thinking in project way, it's not kind of like so encouraged. And even if, you think about a book or a children's book, it's like, oh, that's a very creative thing, but you're making it with the goal of making a book. And you know that there are some rules to a book that you need to follow to make it understandable. And so I think, like, really, it sounds very banal, but lately making for the sake of making, changing shape, materials, trying things that you've never tried before, is what I would recommend, especially in a very prompt-based, solution-oriented world.
Totally. Yeah, I love that, the making for the sake of making. I'll try that myself.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I also just wanted to echo what you were saying earlier about the Ruth Asawa exhibition at MoMA. I got to see it in December and it was fantastic. I also saw the Wilfredo Lamb exhibition while I was there too, and that's still up until April. So I think folks will definitely have a chance to check that out if they're listening to this and want a recommendation.
Oh, there's also, I hope it's still up, like a beautiful Alfred Jensen's exhibition at Pace in Chinatown. I think it's still up. Maybe we can check before we broadcast this, but that's really beautiful. I'm a little obsessed about him.
Wonderful. Well, Giorgia Lupi, thank you so much for joining us, coming back to the AIGA Design Podcast after several years. It was great to catch up with you, learn more about your work, and as always, a pleasure.
Thank you. It was so fun. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.